This traveling exhibit is put together, from my understanding, by Mennonite Heritage Village, the Historical Society of Canada, and the Plett Foundation. I'm just a little bit curious, what was kind of like the starting point of where you guys decided to come together to create this traveling exhibit?
Yeah, it's a big mouthful, but it is really a partnership. So there were two starting points to this exhibit. One was MHV was going to be marking the 100th anniversary of this migration on our own with an exhibit at MHV, and that was going to be kind of a standalone sort of a thing. At the same time, the Mennonite Historical Society of Canada, I think it was back in 2020 probably, started looking at this saying, hey, this is a huge event in the life of Mennonites in Canada, and we need to mark this in some way. So they put together a committee with another big mouthful of a name, and I always kind of forget it. It's the Centenary of Mennonite Immigration Committee, something like that. So they put together a subcommittee, and they said, well, what kind of things can we do? And a traveling exhibit was one of those ideas. So there's kind of two prongs to how this project started, and they were both kind of separate at that point. I forget exactly I'm on the Mennonite Historical Society of Canada board at the time, and Jeremy Weeb was the treasurer. And so we started to chat and say, maybe there's a way that we can do this together. It's a project that's too big for any one of us to carry alone. And so it seemed to make a lot of sense from both of those perspectives. So the partnership for the traveling exhibit is, MHV sort of takes care of the development and the production of the exhibits, because that's what we do best. And the Mennonite Historical Society of Canada is coming alongside with content, feedback on the content through this committee, and then also arranging the logistics of travel, which is a lot more complicated than I think any of us thought. And the Plett Foundation came in right from the start with they have a grant program. So their mandate is focused on the Mennonites who arrived in North America in the 1870s. And of course, the Mennonites who left in the 1920s are the descendants of those folks. So MHV applied for a grant for the Plett Foundation for our exhibit. So they were a major funder of that initial exhibit, which provided sort of the framework for this traveling exhibit. So a bit convoluted. It starts off as two kind of separate projects, but we sort of see, hey, you know what, it's better together, and let's work together on this. So I think what we've come up with is a really interesting partnership of different types of organizations. A museum with, MHSC is more of a kind of public heritage grouping from across Canada, and then the Plett Foundation, a private charity with a grant program. So I think it's been a really good partnership for all three of us.
Yeah, sounds like it. And so how long has the traveling exhibit been going on for? You said it's to celebrate like the 100th anniversary of the migration. So when did it
Yes.
start traveling about?
Okay, well, that's a good question, because the Mennonite Heritage Center Gallery will be its first stop. So March 10th, it will be the first time it's on display anywhere. Where this started out, because the traveling exhibit is a smaller version of what MHV put on last year. So we put the exhibit on the 100th anniversary. So 2022, that was our main exhibit. And then once that exhibit was done, we converted it into a smaller version suitable for travel. So that's kind of been going on from the big exhibit came down in November last year. So it's been a project that's been on the go for a number of years. But in terms of production and moving from a standalone exhibit at the museum to make it to be something that travels, that's what we've been engaged on in the last few months.
Yeah, absolutely. And so what's it all going to consist of? Like, is there like statues, figurines, or artwork? Like, what's all going to be involved in the exhibit?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the exhibit is meant our kind of mission behind this project was to bring the exhibit to places, to smaller museums, provincial Mennonite historical societies, libraries, archives, places that this story is really important. Either the location was a place where Mennonites actually left Canada, or the location is a place where Mennonites, Low German descendant Mennonites, have now returned to Canada. So those places are prominent from basically Ontario all the way for sure to Alberta, And so we wanted the exhibit to go to some of these smaller locations where museums and communities might not have the resources to put something like this on themselves. But it was really important to get the story out to the communities where it actually matters most. And so the exhibit itself is made to be super flexible. So if you have a tiny space, like you have a foyer in your community center and you wanted to showcase it, it's suitable for that. If you have a bigger gallery, it can expand into a bigger version. So what people will see are four kind of crates, crate stations. They're display crates essentially. So big cubes where we have one artifact displayed for each of the four themes of the exhibit. And then we have interpretive pop-up banners beside each of those crates. And then we have some wall panels to fill in some of that content. So the exhibit itself focuses on three main themes. We introduce the topic, and then we look at parting ways. What were the reasons Mennonites left Canada starting in 1922? We look at new beginning. What was life like when they first came to Mexico? And then we look at lasting legacy, with the principal question behind all of our exhibits at MHV is, why does this history matter to us? Why do we need to hear this today? And then some of the other content deals with some of the questions, the popular questions people have with this. The migration to Mexico started off because Mennonites were not allowed to retain their private schools in Canada, in Manitoba and Saskatchewan. And so the question comes, well, what was so important about private schools that it kind of impelled 8,000 people to leave Canada? This is the biggest mass migration out of Canada since Confederation. So it's no small kind of event. So, what are the reasons they left? Was this reasonable? Like, do we look at this and say, they kind of overreacted? Or do we look at it and say, that really, begs the question of, what do we stand for, and how far do we go? So we look at some of those key questions, who were the Mennonites who left, and what happened in Canada after they left? How did the community here in Canada change when 8,000 of the most traditional elements were taken away from it?
That sounds like a really interesting way to talk about Mennonite history. Like just talking about like the themes of like this mass migration. I think that's really cool. Because this is a traveling exhibit and you want to kind of travel to different locations like smaller archives or libraries. Do you have any other places that are signed up already for this exhibit?
Yeah, so the plan is for this to be on the road for about 2 years. So once it leaves MHV on Monday, it's going to be gone. We're hoping until the end of summer 2024. So from Winnipeg, after it's usually in each location for about a month. Some of these are not totally confirmed, but we have high interest from these places. But it will be going to Hague, Saskatchewan, right after Mennonite Heritage Center Gallery. So there's the Saskatchewan River Valley Museum. So Saskatchewan played a big role in this, in the sending communities. So it was the Mennonites who left Canada came from Manitoba and Saskatchewan. So if you think of the Winkler-Morden area, the West Reserve, and the Steinbach area, the East Reserve, those were two of the main geographical locations in Manitoba where these Mennonites came from, or left, I guess. And then in Saskatchewan, the Hague-Osler area was another key area where Mennonites emigrated from. And so it's being shown in Hague, in Swift Current. Then we'll go to Alberta. Lacrete is another is a location. So after we move outside of Manitoba and Saskatchewan, we move away from the communities that were sending communities. And now we start going to communities where the Low German Mennonites are a current population there. And so we're moving to those communities to, try to flesh out that history for people who actually belong to that community where it is part of their history. And Lacrete, Alberta is one of those places. It's in northern Alberta. Since about the 1950s, you have a large return migration from Mexico especially, but also from Paraguay and other places in Latin America. So northern Alberta, southern Ontario, those are places where Low German traditionalist Mennonite communities really are existing today in large numbers. And so we're sending it to those communities as well. So that's kind of the in a nutshell, the first year. So Winnipeg, and then moving into Saskatchewan, then Alberta, Then it'll hit BC at the end of the year and then be sent all the way to Ontario to spend some time in some of those communities where there is that old colony Mennonite presence.
Mm-hmm. So is there anything else that you want to share, whether it's the story of the migration or of the exhibit itself?
Mm-hmm. I think what's interesting for people, like, you know, I often hear at the museum people say, well, history, like, oh, history teaches us where we've been and where we're going, and those sort of, kind of two-line nuggets of wisdom. But I think we did this exhibit in 2022 is when we really started to develop it. And that was right in the midst of a lot of discussion of what is individual freedom, what is the government's right to ask certain things of certain citizens. And Mennonites were in the limelight in that instance, late 2021, 2022. When you look at an exhibit like this, this is looking back at the history of government actions, in some ways against immigrants in the early 1900s, against the non-British population, essentially. And it was taking something from those communities that were really important to them, and that would be private schools conducted in their own languages and according to their own religious beliefs. This is what was so important to Mennonites. It isn't a specifically Mennonite story. The school legislation that mandated public schools in Manitoba and Saskatchewan was aimed at everybody. British, French Catholics were a big target for that legislation. But immigrants got caught up kind of in the crossfire of that French Catholic English, British English sort of conflict or, tension during that time. And this big push in society at that point was assimilating immigrants. And so at the exhibit at MHV, we had this quote from Maclean's magazine in 1908, and it said something like, the biggest problem confronting Canada today is the problem of assimilation, how to take the crude material constantly flowing into the country and create self-respecting, self-helping citizens out of them. And it's just like, it's super jarring for us today. We come from a place where we think, oh, Canada is multicultural and we've always been welcoming and we always appreciate those differences, but we didn't always. And it was the leading edge of society saying, let's use the public schools as a tool. I mean, that's a positive word. A weapon might be a negative word, but as a tool to assimilate children. We can't get their parents anymore, but we can get them through the kids. And so the next generation will be more British and more Canadian and will fit in more with that kind of value. So when we look back on this history 100 years ago, a lot of us, I think, don't have a lot of sympathy for the 8,000 who left. Why are you overreacting? It's not that big of a deal. Public schools, who cares? But when you look back at the pressure that was exerted by the government at that point, especially against Mennonites, because they boycotted the schools, they were fined really harshly by the government, and some even spent time in jail for not sending their kids to the public schools. When you look at how the government reacted to that resistance, it really causes you to think twice about what your stereotypes are, what your beliefs are about people reacting in that way. And for Canadians, I think that's an important lesson from history to look at and say, did we always do things right? No, absolutely not. Do we still do things right today? Well, that's a good question. I hope people ask that one. These things in history, the hard stories of history, I think really make us think and kind of wrestle with our past, but also our present. And for Mennonites, I think a lot of Mennonites in Canada are not from the descendants of people who left. And so we also sort of, I don't want to even say it, but like look at them as the second cousins you don't really care to know. Like they're a little backward. They're traditional in a world of people who are individualistic and more liberal. Mm-hmm. And so we judge them, I think, pretty harshly. And so I think this history kind of has something for everybody, whether you share that Mennonite background or you're looking into Canadian history saying, well, what was it like in society 100 years ago? And was it fair? So I think it has questions to ask us, everybody, on that topic.
Awesome. All
Great.
right.
Thank you very much, Vanessa.
Thank you, Andrea. Have a great day.
Yes, you too. Bye.